HS2. It would be a challenge to find anyone who does not have a firm opinion about it. In October 2024, the Secretary of State for Transport at the time, Louise Haigh, still relatively new to the transport brief, asked James Stewart to carry out a thorough review. Not about whether HS2 was a good idea or not in the first place, but rather, once the government of the day had given the green light to proceed, what has subsequently gone wrong? The level of misinformation and misunderstanding about the project is remarkable. And so James Stewart, a highly experienced investment banker who has also led Partnerships UK and been Global Infrastructure Director of KPMG amongst other high-profile roles, faced quite a challenge to strip back the layers and work out what has indeed gone wrong. His report was completed earlier in 2025, but has just been published by the Department for Transport. The current Secretary of State for Transport, Heidi Alexander, welcomed the report and said the government accepted all 89 recommendations. But accepting recommendations and then driving them through to implementation with relentless energy can be two quite different things. I met up with James at the offices of the Railway Industry Association in London to talk about what he'd found and what he believed the lessons are, not just for HS2, but for all future mega projects. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by James Stewart. Welcome, James. Thank you for coming on Green Signals. A review into HS2. Wow. I mean, some might say that that's a bit of a poison chalice because you're not necessarily going to please anybody in that process. But what was it that made you think, do you know what? I'm going to have a go at doing that.
But you know, I retired 4 years ago, and I went into the meeting with the DFT saying, James, you're not to say yes to this. and then I was sitting there and I thought, you know, here I've got the opportunity to speak to everybody and anybody on the biggest project, probably the biggest project in the world right now.
Yeah.
I love railways, and so I'm afraid to say the drug drew me in of getting involved. And it was an amazing exercise. And actually for me, it also gave me the opportunity to see a lot of old friends, you know, and re-engage with an industry in more depth than I have been doing for the last 3 years. So it's been fantastic. It was very hard work, but great.
And interestingly, of course, it was, I mean, you finished the work some time ago. We've only just had it published recently because it was linked into the whole HS2 announcements that the government wanted to make, which is fair enough and understandable. One thing, it's about 130 pages. It's very comprehensive, and we'll go through some of that in a moment. But you didn't really focus on the project specifically, did you? You looked at really what's happened since the notice to proceed. So this wasn't a look about whether we should have done it at all. This
Exactly.
is about
Or scope, yeah.
scope.
And actually, if it'd been about scope, I would have been less interested because that just gets political and difficult.
Yeah.
And I mean, I was asked really to support the reset and to come up with solutions to how the reset could be done better. And I think the important part of the review, I mean, most people have read the executive summary, and I don't blame them because the executive summary is 5 pages, and the whole thing, as you say, is 130 or more if you include the redacted section. But what I desperately tried to do in the report is actually not just comment on problems, but actually then say, well, here's my recommendation as to what you might do. Now, people won't always agree with those recommendations. And at the very least, if I've started a debate about the recommendations and those solutions, then that's a good thing.
Absolutely. And I completely agree with that. Let's start with a really big section in the report, though, because it's around 130 pages long, of which 32 pages, so, 9.25 of it is about governance. You mention the lack of clarity and confusion with regards to roles and responsibilities in quite a few places, which I thought was quite interesting. And yet there's a chart I think it's on page 17 or something, which shows like an organization chart that actually sets out a proposed governance structure in which there are more bodies, there are more, there's a shareholder board, there's a program board, there are sub boards. You could be forgiven for looking at that and going, Hang on, he's made it more complicated in terms of governance, but I'm guessing it's a little bit more nuanced than that, is it?
Yeah, I think there was a confusion of roles. So I'll give you some very specific, quite techie example. So Mark Wilde now is the accounting officer. The board of HS2 supports him. The board of HS2 has statutory duties, so health and safety would be an example. Yet Mark Wilde is the accounting officer for all the money. So it wasn't clear to me what are the respective roles of the board and Mark Wilde as accounting officer. Then you go into DFT, and you had Alan over as SRO, the sponsor. What was his exact relationship with the shareholder? And indeed, was the financial shareholder, which we might come and talk about that, was the financial shareholder even really present in the governance structure? So that's what I mean about roles and responsibilities. I agree with you. I put as one of my objectives, simplify. I think simplify something. I'm not sure. I think I've made it clearer. I'm not sure I've simplified it and taken out layers. But the thing that makes HS2 different is its sheer size.
Yeah.
It is an order of magnitude bigger than anything else that's ever really been done in this country. So let me give you an example. Lots of people talk about Thames Tideway, the London sewer. The Thames Tideway contract is smaller than the smallest civils contract on HS2. And yet Thames Tideway had a board chaired by Neville Sims. It had some very eminent people on that board concentrating on one contract. HS2 board had 4 civils contracts, a signalling contract, a rolling stock contract, the hybrid bill, etc., etc., etc. And there was just a capacity issue. So one of the reasons I suggested these sub-boards is to bring a bit more detailed scrutiny on the key issues.
And create a bit more bandwidth, because otherwise it's almost impossible to. Exactly. I get that. But it's an interesting point, isn't it, about you've got an accounting officer. I mean, having been one of those, you take that very seriously. You're accountable for the money. But if you're a director, you have Companies Act duties in law.
Yeah.
And did you find sort of any area where not so much lack of clarity, but actually potential conflict in terms of roles and responsibilities?
I don't think. I just think it wasn't clear. So there was confusion, and I did probe to get someone to give me a piece of paper that says this is the role of the accounting officer, this is the role on the board, and I didn't ever really get a piece of paper that told me that. So one of my recommendations is that the terms of reference are revised and that is made absolutely clear.
Yeah. Let's talk about the shareholder board, though, because that does seem to get to the heart of issues around who was sort of responsible for what, really. And you say in the report, any project of this size and scale delivered across multiple decades is going to be impacted by politics. When I looked at comparative projects, and you said Tideway, for instance, Sizewell C, even Crossrail, there was a buffer to the politics. What do you mean by that? And is that where the shareholder board gives you that buffer?
Well, I think they're two slightly different points. It helps, but let's go on the politics. So on HS2, there's the delivery company HS2 Limited. There is the SRO, Alan Over, DFT official, and he goes straight into the Secretary of State, or via Bernadette, the PERMSEC. And so there is, and then the Secretary of State has to liaise with her cabinet colleagues in number 10 and the Treasury. But there's no other person involved. It's officials and DFT and the politicians. Take Sizewell C, EDF are a co-shareholder alongside government. Government has to think about its shareholder role alongside government. Take Crossrail, which I call it Crossrail, sorry.
It's fine. It was Crossrail when it was a project, sure.
So Crossrail had 2 sponsors. It had the Mayor of London and the Secretary of State. And to be honest, they kept each other in check. So if one of them was sort of saying, well, I want to do something, the other would say, well, I'm not sure we want to do that. So in HS2, there was no, well, let's put it this way. I think it's unfair to ask a civil servant to act as a major buffer to politics. So the solutions are, I think there are 2 solutions. One is you bring in an outside shareholder, not possible in HS2, but possible potential on other projects. And secondly, you bring in independent people with hopefully great experience to sit in the project and act as a challenge to the politicians. And the shareholder board, going back to your question about the shareholder board, that is one of the functions of the shareholder board. So I've said, bring in independent investment people, and then if politicians are not making a decision quickly enough, or wanting to do something that is not a good thing from a cost or value for money point of view, then there's someone other than the officials saying, this is not a good idea.
That only works if everybody buys into the model, really. And it's not a comment on Alan Over. I mean, he's a very experienced, seasoned official. So this is about the generality, not the specifics. But if you're going to create a shareholder board, the SRO, the senior responsible officer, the other board, the independent board members, the Secretary of State, everybody's got to go, do you know what? This has value, and I'm going to listen to what all these people say.
Yeah.
And is it a concern that we can actually create that?
Well, I've seen it done, and it happened. As I said on Sizewell, you see it happen because,
and it worked there.
I think I think the people on Sizewell say it works okay. It's not perfect, but none of these things. But let's just go to another very important aspect of the shareholder board. So what I've said is that consistently, actually, this project is bigger than the DFT budget can cope with, and therefore the Treasury are by definition a shareholder in this project, and they have been they have not been part of the governance in that sense. So part of the shareholder board is that the Treasury and the DFT sit alongside each other with external help from these independent experts and focus on the key shareholder issues. Now, what are key shareholder issues? I mean, let's take Euston as an example right now because it's current. What needs to happen on Euston is the scope, design, and cost need to be iterated to come up with the best solution for government as a whole. That is a shareholder issue. Now, if you look at HS2, that never happened, partly because of schedule pressure, but it never really happened. They didn't look at the scope, the proposed scope, the vision, and they didn't then iterate the scope, design, and cost right at the beginning. And that's one of the reasons why we've ended up where we are.
And you have this lovely phrase, which I know is from a guru, I suppose, on project management, which is, think slow, act fast.
Yeah.
And are you saying that actually that process of collaborative brainstorming, almost really, at the beginning, take your time over that, and then when have you decided, do it, but that didn't happen on HS2?
Yeah, I mean, there are two phrases I use. Projects don't go wrong, they start wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a great phrase.
Yeah.
And goodness me, HS2 is a living example. I think got that wrong. And then, as you say, think slow, act fast. And both of them are all about take your time at the beginning to get things right, because things will come by you. And on HS2, this, you will remember this original vision to build the best and the fastest high-speed railway in the world was just not right, and it set the project on a path. And what I think lots of people don't realize, someone said to me the other day, well, that was embedded in the civils contracts. It wasn't embedded in the civils, it was embedded in the hybrid bill. So very, very early on, the hybrid bill was done, and this design around the best and the fastest was just put in concrete in terms of the project and couldn't really be changed thereafter because you couldn't change the hybrid bill. And we built HS1. I mean, why wasn't HS2 done on the same design as HS1? And rather than a brand new design going directly through the Chilterns and with all that complexity.
Okay, let me challenge you a bit on that. You could have put it anywhere, and it would have had exactly the same challenge, right? So really, that's not a defining issue. But one of the interesting things I dug out, Guillaume Pepe, who was the president of SNCF, talking about high-speed railways, and as long ago, actually, as 2012, he was talking at a railway conference or congress, and said, we've got 280 trains a day on Paris-Lyon, the existing high-speed line. I haven't got enough capacity. I need more capacity. We put double deckers on, but really we need a second line. I've never heard anybody say, we've got too much capacity on a railway. It usually is the opposite of that. So 17 trains an hour, maybe that was actually a really smart vision. So do you think it's really fair in HS2 to say, actually, you massively gold plated this thing? Because actually capacity is really important. And wherever it had gone, we'd have had problems.
I think my language on the children's was loose, because I don't think that's the key issue.
Right.
The key issue is when you're doing these mega projects, to me, you have to de-risk them.
Yeah.
Because they are unbelievably difficult.
Yeah.
But when you set off on a project,
That's true,
with a brand new design, right? A train capacity, 17 trains per hour, which had never been done anywhere else in the world, I think I'm right in saying, right? A brand new delivery organization, the knowledge of a planning process which is difficult to say the least. You have to find some way to de-risk it, and therefore Sizewell going with the same design as Hinkley in the nuclear sector is a de-risking of that project. It may not be, there are risks around value for money and going with the same supply chain and all the rest of it, but the fact you're going with the same design is a massive de-risking.
Okay.
And to me, HS2 was simply set up in a way that it was I'm going to say almost impossible to deliver, because it was so complex and big.
So you're kind of saying not that it was wrong to try and do 17 trains per hour in isolation, but when you take everything together, just too many unknowns and too many new things, and it was right. Okay.
And I think everyone admits this now. There's been a confusion between capacity and speed, which is the priority. It was sold on the basis of capacity, yet we wanted to build the fastest railway in the world. And your listeners will know far better than me that fastest brings design challenges, lots and lots of design challenges.
It does, but it can also bring capacity benefits as well, because but no, I take your point. But one of the things you did say in the report, which I thought was really interesting, you talked about gold-plated design, and you said, look, in your opinion, there's a history of gold plating in railway projects in the UK, especially compared to international benchmarks. But there was a really interesting example used of the Colne Valley Viaduct, where you were discussing the impact on cost that the comments of the independent design panel may have perhaps inadvertently had. It says, the specimen design given to the designer responds to the aspiration for the design to reflect the international significance of the viaduct, a sympathetic and imaginative design for the local community, a suitable symbol of the country's future high speed. And you said the result for the Colne Valley Viaduct has been described to you as an iconic design. Are you kind of inferring there that really what they should have just said is, please build me a bridge?
So first, it didn't come from the design part. That came from the hybrid bill.
That was from the hybrid bill.
That came from the select committee.
Right.
So first of all, right. So I heard this phrase, iconic design, being used for the Colne Viaduct. Right. And I then thought, well, that's interesting. Where has it come from in the system?
Yeah.
Right. It didn't those. So the answer is that definitely the design committee, the advisory panel for design gave a view that, but what you've just read out, which I thought was the most compelling example I could find, is it came from the select committee in the hybrid bill process. But what was interesting is, okay, so this viaduct was described to me as iconic, and then I tried to say, well, where does this word iconic come from? I couldn't really find where it had come from in the system. And then I thought, I'm going to go a step further and look at whether it was challenged in any way in the governance process. And again, I could find, I'm not saying it's not there, but I could find no evidence that this design was ever really seriously challenged from a cost point of view in the governance process. I'm not saying it wasn't, but I couldn't find the evidence. Right. So one of my key recommendations is that you should embed a challenge for design into the governance and also planning and environmental stuff. I'm not, the Bat Tunnel is a good example because it's sort of so extreme. But the interesting thing I think about environmental stuff is it is to challenge it, you need someone very robust in the governance structure. And then you probably need to engage the whole of government because it's a whole government issue. But yeah, I've always had a view that we design to a higher higher spec and design, not standard. It's a higher aesthetics. If you go to Spain and look around their metro stations, it's grey concrete.
It is, but if you go to Portugal and look at Lisbon Oriente Station, that is a dramatic cathedral. I know Atocha Station, Madrid was kind of there before, wasn't it? But nonetheless, they're not averse to making design statements on key structures because there's a bit of kind of national pride in it, I guess, as well.
I was at a dinner the other night and someone said, so I thought something really interesting. He said, in Formula One, you have a fixed budget,
Yeah.
which you are not allowed to go over. And therefore the designers work within that fixed budget.
Yeah.
I think we do not do that on these sorts of
Okay.
projects.
I think that's touche. I think that's one or the.
Not my example. I thought it was a great example.
It is a great example. But you mentioned the well-known bat shed, but you also in the context of that you talk about the fact that even though the hybrid bill was passed and had overwhelming majority support, so that was Parliament saying we want this railway line. There were still over 8,200 separate consents to require to acquire. So you take, for example, the bat shed in Sheep House Wood. There we've got a great example of Buckinghamshire Council almost saying, well, I don't really care what Parliament said. We don't agree with it, and we think it's too, and we don't want it. So thank you very much. I mean, A, how on earth were HS2 expected to deal with that? And B, we can change all the governance for major projects in the future as much as we like. But if that process doesn't change, nothing's going to change, is it?
I agree. And this is the problem. You've got a lot of stakeholders allowed to express, I'm going to say, opinions or set down requirements, probably a better way.
Roadblocks, I think,
with no accountability for cost. And that is a massive issue. So the answer has to be, the answer is HS2 can't solve that on their own. DFT can't solve it on their own. There has to be a whole government approach because DCLG or whoever need to come into the equation. And so there has to be a whole government approach to planning consent. Now, we'll come on to the construction contracts, but one of the problems in this project was that a lot of, I mean, I call it assumptions and exclusions, but planning consents are part of that basket. There was an enormous amount of stuff unresolved when the construction contracts were let, and that, in a sense, made it even more difficult to deal with them. But I think you're identifying a problem with a railway that goes through however many county councils and goodness knows what.
And the real problem, of course, for HS2 was go through is the operative phrase, isn't it? Because until you really start to get close to Birmingham, no one's going to have access to this railway. It is going through, which was my point really about whatever route you'd taken.
I think
you'd have had the same challenge.
I think someone told me that London to Birmingham, you'll only ever see a view for 8 minutes.
Well, and some would say, thanks to putting it in tunnels that it arguably didn't need to be in. But anyway, one of the real themes of your review, and you don't necessarily spell it out specifically, well, you kind of do in a couple of places, but it's there, is what I would call capability and capacity, and almost a sense of pace as well. Two bits really struck me. I'll tell you the first one. In finding number 22, you say that approvals for all decisions take too long and need to be streamlined and shortened. And it kind of applies to all sorts of decisions, really. The systems contract is the latest to go through the approvals process, and it's just been approved. The whole process took 8 months, with the DFT government part taking 6 months. I mean, 6 months to approve a contract within government. Surely the fear's got to be that, again, whatever project reset we have, whatever governance structure we have, that issue has fundamentally got to be challenged, hasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's just, can you imagine trying to let a commercial contract and then it disappearing into a black hole for 6 months?
Well, I can, but it's horrific.
It's untenable. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
And that you can't get around for government approvals. I mean, government, that's the way government works. But I think you can streamline them. I mean, there is a problem with sequential approvals. And actually, I have a problem from accountability for sequential approvals, because in my banking days, I was taught, decisions should be made in one place with everyone sitting in the room, because otherwise everyone thinks that everyone else is doing the work and taking responsibility for it. So we have to shorten those approaches. One of the things I've suggested is an integrated assurance plan, and so one set of assurance that supports the decision makers, and that would definitely simplify things. But yeah, it's just too long, and cabinet office are involved at the top. Cabinet office have a place in approvals for, in my view, departments and projects where there isn't necessarily the expertise, or it's a one-off. I mean, I think there's enough investment in expertise below the cabinet office that step is not necessarily needed. That's an example.
But it's a great example, though, isn't it? Because there must be a concern about, I suppose, culture, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way at all, just the way things are done in certain places, right? So I, know from experience of dealing with government departments, brilliant people. I mean, let's be absolutely clear, some smart and also incredibly committed people who believe, right? But the problem is the way they do things. It was described to me once by somebody we both know, actually, as they don't so much manage risk, they seek to avoid it. And the problem with that is it sets in concrete a way of doing things. That's really hard to change. And is the problem not here? Whatever governance model you've got, when you try and get an approval within government, it's just going to be done in a certain way because that's how they do it.
Yeah, but let's go to another issue which I highlight, which is trust. So I say that trust needs to be restored.
Yeah.
Now, what does that mean? Trust is broken. That's what it means. And if you have approvals going through, or the cost estimate would be another example, and people don't trust the people below them in the chain, then they're going to spend more time. It's going to take longer, and all the rest of it. So I'll take the cost estimate as an example. So what I've suggested on the cost estimate is that a sub board is set up, which probably has one or two HS2 board members, but then you bring in some real quality experts on cost method who are respected for their knowledge and their experience, and you get them to scrutinize the cost estimate at the coalface and apply governance at the coalface for that cost estimate. I think then there is a good chance that the department, the sponsor, well, the HS2 board first, then the department, the sponsor, and then the Treasury will have more faith in what's been sent to them, rather than endlessly challenging. And you do then get to a capability issue, which is, I have quite a lot of project experience, but I can tell you, scrutinizing a cost estimate is not in my locker in any detail. I can ask intelligent layman questions, but I'm not an expert. And the problem is, when you're in a position of not really having full knowledge, what do? You just ask more and more questions.
Yeah.
And I say that's one of the complaints that HS2 would make about the department, that, well, in their challenge, all they do is ask for more information. Now, if you get the information right, it's been properly scrutinized by an expert group, then I think you've got more chance of running things through more quickly.
Right. And I mean, trust is, it's a powerful line, and it appears in the report in plenty of places, but that fundamentally comes down to people as well, doesn't it, as well? So do you think that there needs to be a bit of a reset on people in every part of this? Because at the moment, some of them may, for no bad reason, by the way, just carry a bit of baggage.
Well, I think there's that, and good news is I think relationships are much better now, so
Right.
that's definitely improved. However, I don't think you can rely on that continuing. So you have to have a governance structure which deals with when things start to go wrong, which inevitably they do on these big projects. So the program board, which I've introduced, is non-decision making, but it is a problem solving.
Yeah.
It's a problem solving forum, and that proposal on the program board is central to the rebuilding of trust. Independent people again on that board, sitting with the department sponsor and the delivery company HS2, and thrashing out difficult issues and then making and then inevitably the recommendations will go from that to the decision making bodies. But I don't I it's too easy in these big projects to say we're getting on fine at the moment, therefore we don't need this extra governance. I don't most governance unfortunately is designed for when things are going well and not for when things go wrong.
Mm.
And actually when you need it is when things go wrong.
Go wrong. No, sure. I loved the program board idea. I genuinely thought that is I've just sort of like punched the air really, because if it's non-decision making, it can be almost like a blame-free environment where
Yeah.
people can say what they think. It can create a sense of collaboration, but then it would be arguably, quite a brave decision maker who said, well, I, I, I hear what you say, but I think we should do something different. So in a sense, even though it's non-decision making,
Yeah.
the reality is
It's influential.
it's very influential.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Well, I think if it works well, then it becomes
Yeah.
very influential. And it's not a new idea. I mean, my friend David Goldstone worked on the Olympics and they used it. So
Right.
so they use it very successfully. And so I always think the best ideas probably come from somewhere else and have been tested.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have to say something very similar to that was used on the West Coast route modernisation. And you kind of look and think, have we just forgotten how to do certain things? And then maybe we have. There's an interesting comment you make in the report about the government, in its wider sense, tried to apply a standard model to HS2, but actually it, and arguably lots of projects, need a bespoke solution. And it does feel, doesn't it, sometimes that they tried to force a model on something that was never going to work.
Yeah, I mean they used the same government model. I mean let's take a really simple example: inflation.
Yeah.
In any normal project, the Treasury will say to a department, you cope with inflation from your budget. But that's the basic model. Well, on HS2, that clearly was not possible. I mean, there needs to be a special deal on inflation. I mean, the whole way inflation's dealt with in these projects, the fact that all the prices we're still looking at are 2019 prices.
It's really worrying this, James, because when we rebase to 2025,
there'll be
the media are going to have an absolute field day. And it's only, I say it's only inflation, but it's not the project going wrong, it's inflation.
But I do make a few recommendations. It's a big report, so I have to have a few notes. But I mean, they aren't recommendations actually. They are a proposal.
Right.
So I think it would be cheeky of me to start recommending things for the way the whole system of government works. But so I say HS2 should have its own DEL. So in layman's terms, that means treated as a separate department, i.e. separate to the DFT, ring-fenced in the DFT budget. I say there should be a long-term settlement, 5 years, because I mean they have for the last few years they've been on 1-year settlements,
which is crazy. No, absolutely.
There should be flexibility to move money from 1 year to the next, which I accept is hard. Inflation risk should be dealt with separately. HMT and DFT should be shareholders. And actually, I do say this is an idea. This is what happened on Crossrail, that DFT should take the first loss. So if when the first problems arise, DFT take the first hit, but then HMT are sitting as the funder of last resort. On Crossrail, it was TfL who took the first hit, and then DFT were the funder of last resort.
Focus is the mind, though, doesn't it?
And they sound quite simple changes, but they are massive changes for a project like HS2. And I think, to be fair to the officials in DFT and HS2, not just being fair, this is the reality, that they were operating in a system of government that made it very difficult to manage this project.
No, that becomes clearer the more you more you think about it and the more you read. Can we just talk a bit for a moment about Euston, right? Because it has almost become a bit totemic as a problem. You quite rightly describe it as a multi-billion project, and then say in its own right with different stakeholders, which is fair. I do have some sympathy with HS2 on this, because in the end, it's a railway station that's the terminating point of a high-speed line from the Midlands and the North. And yet sometimes you feel as if everybody's kind of piled in to get their little bit of project funded by HS2. So Network Rail's existing station, I chuck that in. the mayor very cannily, yeah, no, we want a nice new tube station at Euston, chuck that in, and now we've got all this sort of property development. But in the end, it's a station. Have we not just overcomplicated by trying to do too much?
Well, the first thing, just to say, when I was talking about simplifying and de-risking the project, I mean, I said this 5 years ago and I wasn't very popular. My view is that Euston should have been taken out of HS2 Limited. Simply not, well, because I don't think using a word you use, the bandwidth to deal with it. I think, and I'm not sure I agree with you as a railway station, by the way. I think you can view it as a railway station with a regeneration project attached, or you can view it as a regeneration project that has a railway box. Interestingly, if you go back to Crossrail, the Canary Wharf station was handed over to Canary Wharf, and they did a regeneration project and built a box for the railway. And actually, when we were looking at the affordability, right at when it was being given the go, they came in with a much cheaper price, and that helped the affordability. So I think the way it's being viewed, it is a regeneration project, and you have to build HS2 platforms in the middle of it. The skills required for that project are different to just railway skills, which is why it's so challenging. If you just built the HS2 station, I think everyone would say it was a big missed opportunity.
Well, they might well do, and I fully accept that you can view it as a regeneration project that's got a station rather than the other way around. I can't argue with that at all. However, when you start doing airspace development and so on, you make the station more expensive, more complex, and so maybe that's the way we want to go. But there's a danger, though, that those interfaces become no less complex.
Yeah,
You know,
and yeah, I would say there's another issue, which is the government has said that private funding needs to be put into that station,
Yeah.
and that's only going to really, well, one of the ways in which that's going to be done is the redevelopment. I mean, Euston, I didn't spend a lot of time on Euston because it's another subject in itself. But what I basically said was that this, I did look at it, and the scope, the funding, and the governance delivery structure, I couldn't see any evidence of what they were. So that's the first step.
right.
And yeah, as I said earlier, they've got to iterate scope, funding, and design, and everything else. I mean, in these big projects, someone you will know very well from Crossrail. I remember when I was looking at Crossrail and trying to, I got rung up and said the Prime Minister wants to do Crossrail. There are two challenges. One is to make it affordable, and the second is to come up with a delivery structure which gives the politicians confidence that it's going to be delivered within that affordability limit. And I think Euston's exactly the same.
Right.
They need to determine what they want to do, how much money they've got, and then design a delivery structure accordingly. And I don't know. As you said, I'm 5 months out of date with my report, so I'm not quite sure what's happened the last 5 months.
It's ironic, though, isn't it, when you mention Crossrail and the Elizabeth line? I mean, nobody wanted to really be associated with Crossrail in the last sort of 2 years, really. So despite all our best efforts, we ended up with something which was over budget, running dreadfully late. Of course, now it's open. It's the greatest thing ever built. I suppose maybe it's a whimsical thought. I just wonder whether we'll have the same view of HS2 in a few years' time. But
I mean, the wonderful thing about the Elizabeth line is it's one of the very few projects I know where the passenger forecasts, the passenger numbers have exceeded all the forecasts. And that is unusual in an infrastructure project, but it is a brilliant project.
Not in railway projects, incidentally, though. It's quite fascinating. I keep getting beaten up all the time for saying, no, you shouldn't reopen lines. And then every time we do, the passenger ridership blows the forecast. But
I mean, it is a massive success, but there are some big lessons to be learned on Crossrail.
Sure.
We haven't talked about one of the big, if you look at the future challenges, the two biggest challenges on HS2 right now are the reset of the civils contracts and the whole systems integration, taking it into operation.
It's massively complex.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
I completely.
And that those are the two big challenges, and Mark is across both, I know.
Now, you mentioned the civils contracts, though, the major work civil contracts, the MWCCs as they're called. They are dedicated to a whole section in your review and your report. And then it just says that wonderful line, this section has been redacted, i.e. taken out for commercial reasons of commercial sensitivity. Now, we get that. There are negotiations ongoing. We don't want to make Mark's job any harder than it already is. But is there anything from your review of these massive contracts that you can say, actually, what I found was this, and really, this is what we need to change for the future?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is read right to the end of the report into the wider lessons section, because there are some wider lessons on the MWCC.
There are, yeah.
So there is some stuff in there, and there's some stuff in the exec summary. I can say quite a lot. I mean, I think it was the right decision to redact it, because you say, what's the point in adding risk to a very difficult commercial process? So I think it was the right decision. But I mean, there is a lot in the MWCC contract. So the first thing I would say is that those contracts should not have been let in the way they were at the stage 2 stage.
Right.
And Mark has effectively said the same thing in his letter. And I say, you can take that view easily in hindsight, but I think the evidence was there at the time. And now, why is that? By the time they got to stage 2, this is in the public domain, it's an NAO report, total design was 13%, scheme design was 70 to 80%. It was intended to be 100%.
Yeah.
One of the contracts was further advanced, so you probably could have let that contract, see how that went, and then let some others in a phased way. The second reason is that the sheer size of those contracts, in my view, exceeded the capacity of the industry at that time. And that is one of the reasons why the risk appetite of the contractors was so low. So everyone says they're cost plus. Well, why are they cost plus? Well, one of the reasons is because these contracts were enormous in respect to their balance sheets, and
you could wipe them out if it
yeah,
were.
exactly. And so we ended up very quickly with cost plus contracts. And this capacity of the construction industry is a massive issue. You know, if you look at the infrastructure strategy, which you talked about a couple of weeks ago, that is a big program. And yet, I've said, I don't think the construction market is fit for purpose to deliver that pipeline in terms of capacity. It's just not there. And you know, you had a look at the modern industrial strategy. I mean, it's not surprising. A modern industrial strategy doesn't really look at construction, but yet it is one of the critical enablers for our infrastructure. It's interesting. They talk about a new supply, I can't remember what they call it, a supply chain entity, which is going to look at capacity. Well, I googled supply, whatever the thing, supply chain center, I think it was called. Couldn't find anything about it. So I think government needs to take construction capacity very seriously. I think they need to take a whole government approach to dealing with the construction industry. So if you're Mark and you're dealing bilaterally with the major contractors, your leverage is pretty low. If you're government looking across that program, your leverage is quite large. But at the moment, Mark is, I think, pretty much having to do it on his own. Sorry, I've gone off at a tangent.
No, but there's
bring me back to.
It's fascinating because you're absolutely right. I was just sort of sat there going, no, I totally agree. You know, this construction capacity issue is a huge thing if you believe in growing your infrastructure. You can't. The two things are, you know, they are axiomatic.
But then you go back to So you then go back to the fact that design maturity, as I said, was less than expected. But then I said earlier that the level of some assumptions and exclusions was very, very significant. And we might come on to schedule priority versus cost priority later. But you know, there was a pressing need schedule-wise to sign these contracts. They were signed earlier than they should have been, as Mark says in his letter, and I say. And you had all these assumptions and exclusions. Now, what does that mean? Massive retained risk by by HS2 and the government as a whole. Yet the lean client approach, or the thin client approach, as I think as some people want, was the approach adopted and not changed.
And those two positions are incompatible.
And not changed. So suddenly we've got all this retained risk, no increased resources, stuck with the IPT structure and lean client. And, you know, I talk about capability not being sufficient, but actually this is structural. This is philosophical in the sense that you can't continue with a lean client approach when you're on cost plus and there's that level of assumptions and exclusions. And not surprisingly, that there have then been problems. The other thing I say in the lessons learned is that if you're going in with that level of uncertainty and risk, you've got to think about your negotiating levers. Now, I'm going to be very simplistic now. Between stage 1 and stage 2, there was inherently a right to retender at stage 2. But the momentum and pressure and everything sort of rendered that use. I couldn't find, I'm not saying it's not there, I couldn't find an equivalent retender right in stage 2. Now, even if you have a retender right, it's not much good unless you're preparing for it 2 years in advance. Yeah. So my simplistic view on these sort of contracts is, why wouldn't you set them up so that they break after 3 years, and then it's up to the contractor to prove that they should continue?
But that point about schedule and cost, risk and interplay is that really came into play, isn't it? Because you see in this report, I mean, you refer a number of times to almost like a fear, I think, that if you just didn't keep going, you just didn't keep the pace going, somebody might cancel it or something might change or whatever. And that's almost like fear seems to have driven quite a lot of stuff.
The statement that schedule was prioritized over cost is not disputed. The reasons why that was the case are disputed by some. I came up with 4 reasons. So first was delay. Well, the first one is very odd, but I found this sort of fundamental belief that delay will add to cost because the fixed costs extend over a longer period. And I said, well, surely that means if you incentivize cost, then you're inherently incentivizing schedule. But that is a deeply held view amongst lots of people. I personally think it's a bit flawed. The second is that politics, there was a massive political, push to keep the project going and all the rest of it. And go back to what we said right at the beginning, not a buffer for that view. So no one really being prepared to stand up and say, no, we can't let all 4 contracts. We're going to have to introduce a delay because otherwise, all that sort of. The third, fear of project cancellation. Not everyone agrees with that. I think it was present, and it is a natural thing. If you're worried about a project being cancelled and you delay, then you're giving more ammunition to the people who want to cancel. And then the fourth is actually what we were talking about earlier. If you have 6 to 9 month approval processes for contracts, you're trying to catch up, so you're squeezing. So those are the 4 reasons I came up with schedule being prioritized over costs. And the bizarre thing is that the civils contracts have had an incentive mechanism with both cost and schedule. The cost went out the window. Cost incentive went out the window very quickly. And so you were left with this schedule incentive. So you actually had a perverse thing of people trying to maintain schedule on cost plus contracts.
We know what's going to happen.
That's not great. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Let's just get a crystal ball out for a moment and look into the future, because I think we probably all agree HS2, in terms of the equity position, if you like, that the government's got, that's not going to change now. We've got to find a way to reset it, but that fundamental structure is not going to change. But when you look at other projects in other countries, so take high-speed line that was built between Tours and Bordeaux, that was very much done on DBFO. I mean, quite literally, the government, I suppose, through its sort of state body, said, this is what we want. And really, it was down to the concessionaire to design it, build it, finance it, operate it. Now, I know on the finance,
I think
there's
what was it, 8 billion euros?
something like that,
That's the number I got in my
and
head.
quite a lot of grants,
Yeah.
quite a lot of government taking first positions on risk, and the revenue risk model is quite interesting. But nonetheless, it's still very much a DBFO structure. They went out of fashion in this country. Everybody kind of goes PPP, PFI, and that's, ooh, not sure I want to do that. Surely, though, the disciplines that that brings is something we really now need to think about again for the future. And if we had, could it have helped HS2?
I think HS2 was probably too big.
Too big, okay.
So, but the principle, I mean, I think there's quite a lot in the French model. So the French, I'm not an expert on this, but I'm just saying what people have said to me. If you look at the French contractors, their tier one contractors, Bouygues, Vinci, do a lot more. So for instance, most of the tier one contractors in the UK outsource design. The French hold it in-house. It is no coincidence that the one that was furthest ahead, in my view, it's no coincidence, the one that was furthest ahead on design did most of their design in-house. So I think there are some structural differences between the way international contractors work and the way UK contractors work, which I think should be looked at. I say I'm not an expert, but people, I don't have a lot of time to look into it, but people have said to me that the way tier one, tier two, tier three all come together in UK projects is an issue that needs to be looked at and creates more interfaces than you might want. But I think where you can DBFO, then I think you should. I mean, you were talking about the PFI structures a couple of episodes ago, and I was spent a lot of my life on PFI. I would defend PFI for the development phase of projects. I would defend it for the construction phase as producing good outcomes. Where it has come unstuck is during the operational phase. But that's where the issues are. Now, I think there are ways you can address that. But I think for designing, building a railway, that DBFO approach has a lot of benefit. The only caveat I would make is that I spend quite a lot of time driving through France, and there are there's a lot of countryside and not a lot of towns. So I think the planning issues in France are much less than here. I mean, that's,
A similar argument could probably be made for Spain as well.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So and DBFO works well when you can effectively transfer risks and the risks are known. The problem with building high-speed rail in this country is, however much you try and do that, there are still going to be lots of unknowns.
Yeah.
And that makes it more difficult.
Yeah. I've got final question, if I may. I mean, it is a really comprehensive report, and I actually thoroughly enjoyed reading, actually. There's so much rich stuff in it. And you've come up with 89 recommendations. The Secretary of State welcomed the report when it was published, said they've accepted all 89, which is brilliant, right? But they say a week is a long time in politics. And so next week's issue is something completely different. And there is a risk that, a report like this, is going, right, we've kind of moved on. What would you say, though, if there's ever a risk of that happening? Okay, I know 89 is a lot of recommendations, but you must do these three or these four. If you do nothing else, government, you have to do these. What would they be?
I think the most important recommendations are around the cost estimate, which they're on, but the project has been bedeviled for the last 2 years from a disagreement on cost. And if you have a disagreement on cost, you have no trust, you have no performance mechanism, you have nothing. So the recommendations around the cost estimate are absolutely critical. And for me, the governance, I'm afraid to say the governance proposals in all their entirety are very, I was asked to do this. I was asked to come up with a new governance structure because the previous one was not seen to be working. And so governance, and then the last one is capability. Now that you spotted it, you're one of the very few people who spotted in the infrastructure strategy that they've given delivery bodies more flexibility on pay,
Yeah.
which is needed. I mean, you can't. The problem with not paying people is A, you find it difficult to attract them, but B, even when you attract them, they don't hang around for long. They'll come and do an interesting job for 2 years, but then they've got to pay the mortgage, so they go elsewhere. And so this pay issue, being able to pay people a market rate, not inflated prices, a market rate is very important to attract the right people, and they've got to attract people for the long term. The churn at a senior level in HS2, well, I'm right to be honest, through the organisation, but particularly at senior level, has been far too high, and they've had secondees, by the way, being paid multiples of what a permanent employee would be paid in key jobs. Everyone talks about capability. I'm just going to read. I'll give you one final thing, which I actually wrote down this morning when I was thinking about it. So I say good project delivery comes from 4 things: a delivery team with high capability and expertise, access to expert advice, and what I mean by that is an in the old days PUK, it could be internal expert advice from within government or externally.
Yeah.
There's been very little of that on both at a sponsor level and a delivery company level. Expert challenge from the governance structure at the coalface.
Yeah.
And then timely assurance underpinned by accurate information. The one they had assurance. I do a lot of stuff on assurance in the report. So assurance probably gets a tick. The other 3 I would give a cross to.
Right.
So it's those 4 that come together to give the overall capability to do delivery.
And when you say it like that, you kind of go, it's obvious, really. But
Yeah.
And I suppose I think that's the brilliance of this report, really. There's nothing in here which is really that controversial. It is good, solid, common sense, evidence-based, very practical.
Yeah. But I can't remember, I think it's at the end of the assurance section. Your point is so right that you do these reviews and you're just terrified nothing, in the drawer, nothing ever happened. So I actually got a section in the report on what you do with reviews. And Mark's doing this. Mark, I've said to them, don't accept all my recommendations. You're going to have to prioritize them because you can't do all of them at the same time. Put them alongside your own review. There were a few other reviews going on.
Yeah.
And come up with a consolidated list of priority review, and then implement it,
and then do it,
and then check that you have done it.
Yeah. Well, unbelievably sensible. Let's hope that's exactly what happens. James, thank you so much for spending today. It has been fun. It's been a while since we've had a chat like this, but honestly, thoroughly enjoyed it and really enjoyed reading this report, which is so important. Let's hope that everybody acts on it. James Stewart, thank you very much.
Thank you.